Can we start? Yes. Okay, we switch to English for this second session because we have this international guest today. Well, I am Andrea Dutto. I am part of the scientific committee of this course, and it is with a great pleasure that I introduce Maria Fedorchenko on the occasion of this second meeting of a PhD seminar that involves both the disciplines of architecture and philosophy to discuss on such a problematic lemma as that of scheme, or rather schema, as we prefer it to be left in Italian. And I will spend some remark on this because at least actually regarding the Italian architectural scenario, the word scheme is used as synonym more or less of diagram. Both stand for a kind of a simplified representation of topographic space into a topological one. Therefore, a translation of something that is characterized by measurements and shapes into something that is kind of more abstract. So, and this is what happens in Italy. But I am suspicious that this is not a matter of linguistics, but rather of what I say indifference. Indifference towards deepening of this concept, and something is something that should be acknowledged as a typical Italian issue. For instance, I would mention, make an example due to the fact that we are trying to make this dictionary for this course, that in the recent atlas curated by Marco Biraghi and Alberto Ferlenga, entitled Architettura del Novecento, that is a huge 3-volume book for a total amount of more or less 3,000 pages and hundreds of theoretical items that were written by the most relevant, let's say, Italian academics, among the most relevant Italian academics. Neither scheme nor diagram are mentioned, are included among the items. So this is strange, or at least this is strange enough to be simply acknowledged as a kind of a forgetfulness. This lack, in my opinion, suggests for a substantial indifference for this issue in the Italian academia. More generally, this sounds like an overall indifference towards an entire season of international debate about the so-called diagram architecture that lasts more than a decade, starting from the mid-90s, and today is overtaken by other attempts like the so-called parametricism and computational architecture and so on. In all this, however, the discourse did not stop altogether, and particularly in the Italian architectural scenario, in the English academic scenario, the diagram is still fully alive, thanks to several protagonists, of which Maria Fedorchenko is certainly one of the most interesting one we could have with us today. Maria Fedorchenko has been unit master at the Architectural Association of London since 2010, where she was also involved in the program Housing and Urbanism, and the visiting school since 2008. She has taught at UC Berkeley, UCLA, and the CCA from 2003. As a unit master at the Architectural Association, Maria leads the diploma unit number 8 with a group of students that varies from year to year, from between 10 and 20 students, right? This unit somehow has the aim to engage the European city and attempts to expand and redefine the core elements of the city. All this is undertaken through the correlation of multiple levels of work and on discontinuity, focusing on what Maria calls urban meta-elements, as well as mythical and spatial journeys across imaginary landscapes, interconnecting transition of culture, urban and environmental archetypes. In all this, the diagram plays a major role, and I would say it works as the very representative concept of the kind of approach Maria proposes about architectural design. It is a work that tries to simultaneously embed theory and practice at once. So even from her writings and her somehow extended brief that are published on the AA website, it's pretty evident how Maria's concerns about the diagram is something that relates to a tradition, therefore something that is not new, something that is not invented. And I would say that this is exactly what we're interested about. The diagram is built in the same way that architecture is built. That is, by choosing reference that could specifically face a problem. So, therefore, the diagram is not innocent. It is not a way to be fancy or whatever. So, in this sense, especially in her didactic work, Maria claims for friendship and mediations within a stream of precedents, like from Filarete to Colas, from Boulez to Ungers to Kant, to Krier, of course. So, Kant is not, unfortunately not, sorry.
Can't cope with Kant. Yeah.
Nevertheless, in this way, through the diagram, Maria is able to set up a very special educational activity. In other words, the diagram is not seen as a matter of tools intervening in one simple phase of design and then abandoned afterwards. The diagram has an all-encompassing role towards the project and has the capacity to produce effects in reality. And this is the direction in which her recent platform called the Placat, that is a platform for provocation, really points to, seemingly. So the diagram is also a tool for mediation, and the title of today's lecture is what this suggests, somehow the diagram as a tool of mediation. However, in order to conclude this presentation, I see in this definition you provide of diagram a kind of a productive ambiguity. Because what we can notice, in fact, is that on the one hand, instances of provocation and mediation require the use of diagram as a tool. But on the other hand, mediation and provocation are also necessary tools to produce the diagram. So in this ambiguity, I see Maria's proposals in perfect harmony with the idea of architecture that is constantly renewed within its own complexity and contradictions. So please join me welcoming Maria Fedorchenko.
Thank you very much. Very glamorous introduction. I appreciate this. So yes, I think this is a really fantastic way to describe what I do, omitting all the obvious struggles and mishaps and inconsistencies along the way. So I appreciate this very much. But I think I'd like to talk to you today in a way that it also reveals a little bit of the difficulty that one encounters when you try to take all of these different aspirations and theoretical ideas about what diagrams specifically can do or could do in the future, and what happens when you try to pull theory into a practical context and specifically academic experiments. So I would like to, just by way of introducing a little bit and slightly informally, what I would like to talk about. I think that, as Andrea mentioned, diagrams are still very much alive in the discourse of architecture and definitely very much in use in the practical day-to-day lives of the architects, even professional architects. But there's definitely a very, I would say, we have a difficult relationship with diagram now because of its almost excessive inflation and infatuations we've suffered with diagrams in the 90s, then led to a much more precipitous fall. And we've become somewhat anxious, almost fearful of the idea of diagram dominating so much our discourse and practice that we would try to almost avoid giving them as much explicit role as we've done in the previous term. Now, as I would argue, diagrams have not arrived into architectural way of working in the 90s, and they haven't really departed afterwards. They've always been a very much content at the core of architectural thinking. But today's anxiety and ambiguity with the way we relate to diagram, I think requires us to take another look at what happened at the most recent chapter of diagrammatic work and how it could begin to affect the next chapter. I believe that our diagrams would continue to very much energize the way we work and connect it, create a crucial bridge between conceptual and practical way of working within architecture. But in order to dispense with some of the kind of unhappy baggage, I guess, of the previous methodological experiment, I would like to take a look from today's point of view at some of the problems that were encountered by recent generation, and then to look at the tensions that they evoked in a much more long-term perspective, from a point of view of disciplinary history that spans, much longer than a single century in a way, but especially focusing on 20th century. And then I would like to actually begin to talk about what next. How do we begin to reinsert diagrammatic thinking into future theories and practices of architecture? So this is just to help you navigate, because I would like to use quite a lot of images. So please bear with me if there's a bit of a visual overload from the screen, but I would like to give you that map so that it helps a little bit to mentally construct a navigation tool through the lecture. So the introduction, I would briefly introduce how I see some of the conditions that triggered the almost inordinate fascination with the diagram in the latest chapter. Then I would look at 3 different kinds of schisms that were produced, and then look at these problems as both oppositions as they would emerge, let's say, through postmodern thinking, and then try to look at them in a post-dialectic way. In the second part, I would like to actually offer what next, the future extension of what I would say of the diagrammatic project, and that is very recent work. It's something I'm still working on, so please bear if this is more of a kind of an attempt to formulate a future agenda that is no longer centered around oppositions, but rather tries to mediate between different domains of architecture, between different concepts that define an architectural project. And it is something that my academic work is very much focused on. So if we move briefly into introduction, let's just say that I was very much one of those victims of the theoretical agitation that happened in the 90s and 2000s. And the specific causes for that, I think, if we summarize it very crudely, are a few. Mainly, it was a theoretical revision of how we approach the city. So the theories of the city started to give us an idea that somehow contemporary city, and especially, let's say, if we compare American and European cities, at the time I'm also crossing the ocean quite a few times between Europe and America, and my education and my work spans both continents. And I found that is definitely very difficult to understand, that somehow the contemporary city has mutated. It is no longer visible. And everything I knew and my friends and colleagues knew about the city somehow not applicable anymore. Everything that we know about the elements of the city, its structure, its organization, is no longer fitting with the much more emergent, fluid, and dynamic systems that would define a contemporary city. And the publications and the research endeavors of the time are very much focused on this problem of illegibility and incompatibility with conventional visual tools, maps, diagrams, and drawings as we've known them before. And in a way, we somehow have to make sense of the city as shifting fields that no longer prioritize static objects such as architectural structures. It is all coexisting in a very complex ecology where different kinds of artificial and natural elements coexist. And it is very much driven by the concept of infrastructure, both infrastructure in terms of transit, but also infrastructure in terms of exchange and material and capital flow. All of this new kind of infrastructural city, and that is not to mention the whole kind of fascination with data and virtual reality even, creates a kind of a cut in a bibliography about the city. And this is what I mean by a kind of a schism that we were left to deal with, where on one hand, we have this city of bits and flows, and on the other hand, we have a city of, figures, the city of forms, the city of archaeology, the city of typological descendants. How do we make sense of both of them was very, very difficult. And in a way, the diagram became one of these tools that would also align with the second trigger, I think, for the schisms that we've inherited, is the theory of not just understanding space, but also how the space is actually created or produced. So as architects, we're no longer asked to design structure, we were asked to think about the dynamic processes of spatial production, and using theories, for example, Henri Lefebvre theory, that we need to understand different modalities of space and different formats of their production. And we architects, impoverished as we are with our geometric format, cannot simply cope with our conventional representational tools and design methodology with how the space would be produced. I'm talking about all these references leading to the third, which I thought was one of the main triggers of the destabilization of the discipline, is as a bit of an outsider to philosophy, because for me it was, as an architect, as a designer, as a student of architecture, primarily concerned with the practice and process of design. But it was such a powerful influx that it almost threatened for a moment to challenge our own sense of disciplinary expertise and specificity. That third trigger that came with both the infrastructural terms and approach to the city and both the conceptual kind of expansion of how we understand production of the city is the interdisciplinary exposure. And here we're talking about borrowing, and I would say without the proper depth involved in how to actually transpose or translate from philosophy to architecture, a series of really powerful concepts, and along with them, what we would begin to associate graphic tools, diagram, abstract machine. This is obviously something that built on the writings of Deleuze and Guattari, and we architects, I would claim, didn't fully understand what was being introduced into the discipline. So, but we caught a few things on the surface and we ran with them. And I would find that in a way it didn't do justice to the full power of the concept of the diagrammatic abstract machines, but however, it did create enough, let's say, unfavorable comparison with what a poor drawing or projective drawing could do, and what a fully empowered conceptual diagram, especially coming from such a rich intellectual context, did to architecture. What it had opened floodgates to the representations that would then come in to compensate for the lack of the abstract, let's say, graphic language of architecture to correspond to those desired theories that we try to incorporate. I would say from my point of view today, because I'm very much concerned with a disciplinary project and a continuity of disciplinary project, is that was in a way a rich, exciting, potentially very productive moment, but it also was a dangerous one, because we swung the gates, we flooded ourselves with interdisciplinary reference, but we didn't have enough of a disciplinary stability and a kind of a strong inner core of the discipline at the time to be able to withstand and filter and digest all the inputs of the diagrams and experimental practices. Because they're less encumbered with disciplinary rigor, they were able to open the floodgates even further, and the design process becomes in some way hijacked by the diagram. Well, the reason I'm being slightly ironic in describing it this way, because I think they're the seeds of the reasons why there was a counter reaction of a flooding of external diagrammatic representations. But now let's look, I'll try to go brief here, and let's go a bit more informally to get to the sort of the future, I guess, ideas. That there were few things that that newly discovered diagrammatic process was promising us. And whether it delivered or not is something that we need to assess. And again, a much more mature and I think inclusive and balanced way of looking at this is needed. Because if we almost believe wholeheartedly the verbal promises of the diagrammatic practices generation, then we'd find them lacking and failing. But if we actually look at the struggles and oppositions from the point of view of disciplinary history and the, in a way, persistence of these tensions, then they are no longer failures. They're much more just an expected step on our disciplinary evolution. One of the problems is process and product, and the dynamic processes and infrastructures and the flows that run through them would somehow promise us a fundamentally different way of conceiving the city and conceiving architectural element. To be, again, crude and simplistic, what do we end up with? We end up looking with infrastructures and flows of exchange. We look at fields, and all of this coexists in a kind of ecology. If we understand those three terms as a kind of the diagrammatic systems that were promising to deliver a different approach, those would be the three. Infrastructures, very much at the core of the thinking about what the new context of the city would be, and the interest in the idea of the field and representing dynamic field conditions that shift across the urban surface, and understanding that analogy to landscape ecology is something that would be the only kind of really practically applicable spatial representation of the dynamic process, that architects favored ecology for that reason. It had much more spatial associations behind it. Let's look a little bit at what it meant for the design process. Oversimplifying what we understood by context of the dynamic systems of the city, architects began to use diagrams as a kind of a magic formulas. We would begin to look at the site and hope that diagrammatic analysis would miraculously deliver a fundamentally different basis, if not even a ready-made project altogether. The so-called deep planning approach that was proselytized by practices from UN Studio, VRDV, and a number of Dutch practices that you could see as descendants of Rem Koolhaas training. There was an acceptance of the analysis of the reading of the flow of the site, and then production of diagrams that maybe align with the idea of datascape that was practiced by VRDV. These quantitative analyses of the site fluctuations and intensities would somehow give an approximation of the site as a kind of a fluctuating graph. The problem became when all of these diagrams of flows, intensities, occupations would need to ultimately be translated into architecture. And that's when the problems began to surface. We begin to see much more literal relationship between trajectories, right? And the channels and the kind of formal sections that begin to occupy the site, the undulations of the surface. The indexical maps of the vectors, I apologize, some of the bleached white slide may be difficult to read. The fluctuations of circulation that were carried through the indexical diagrams actually became literally mapped out into, I guess, pseudo-topology. I mean, you were talking about the question of topography versus topology. The problem of continuous surface was used as another hold-all trick, that somehow the surface modulated in relationship to the diagrams of flow would somehow be able to produce a new infrastructure. And sorry, before I move into disciplinary basis, I think it's important to distinguish that what was promised to us as a so-called infrastructural urbanism, if we use the terminology of, for example, Stan Allen, writing on field conditions and the turn to infrastructural way of thinking about the city, or should we say return, because it was very much a return of modern way of thinking. In the end, we ended up with so-called infrastructuralism, as Reiser Miyamoto terms it, and it is much more direct and a much more literal response to what is understood as infrastructural flows of the site. And I think it is an issue. One of the reasons I think we fell into these traps is we simply overlooked the fact that we're not the first ones who get so excited about, the city is made out of systems and there are these flows, and if we understand the flows and we can begin to modulate the flows and we can create a magic intercepting devices. These fascinations with the modern city are hardly new, and architectural responses are in a way very similar. To insert a kind of analytical, conceptual apparatus that would mediate between the city and architecture, and then it would attempt to create a new idea of an architectural project that is already pre-attuned to urban systems. But we've also forgotten the other flip side of the problem, where the large systemic proposals for the city would always have to confront the problem of formal translation or realization, and sometimes the heavy, literal, and somewhat imposing or controlling problems of the megastructural project. The systems, the networks became much more related to megastructures and space frames, or the fields became much more related to the project of the mat building that already articulates the tension between solid and void, and object and figure and ground in a much more sort of alternating way. I'm using these as relatively superficial reminders just to kind of create a bit of a shadow context to the struggles of the 90s and 2000s, where one of the symptomatic projects, besides, for example, UN studio work here, Stan Allen's Barcelona logistical zone, where these flows and fields and artificial ecologies of the sites were subsumed with a kind of a new kinds of diagrammatic representations, the kind of meta diagram of multiple shifting layers of the site. Beautiful, virtually illegible, virtually useless when it comes to direct application as a design directives, but yet they captured an imagination of students and teachers of architecture of the time tremendously. The problem, of course, becomes when you look at the specific diagrams and relationship of them to an architectural proposition, and again, oversimplifying this quite rich project, we could say that all of these programmatic flows, fields, and ecological elements end up in a very simple project, elegant, that correlates the logistical relationship of the ground condition to a larger space frame. And in the end, it could be read in much more conventional terms, and perhaps it is one of the projects that created this false promise of completely open-ended, fluid, uncontrolled, kind of diagrammatic management of the site rather than design, and yet delivered, like other projects at the time, a relatively expected architectural response. We see megastructures, space frames, master plans making a return. Let's look at this moment a little bit further of this cut between thinking in the now with a sort of diagrammatic theoretical fascination versus thinking in the longer disciplinary history, but this problem that we don't really control the site. The diagrammatic way of working is very much focused on releasing a design control. And as you know, this has always been a big tension between modern and postmodern ways of thinking, the kind of the unification and homogeneity of the design position versus heterogeneity and release and ambiguity of how the site would be read and how the site would be projected. I think that is very important to place it in a slightly different disciplinary framework in order to understand what is the potential of the diagrammatic way of working with regards to controlling versus releasing the control of the design. So projects such as Barcelona logistical zones fit into the general category of so-called diagrammatic frameworks that were delivered instead of the project. The diagrammatic frameworks would often be represented by these rich diagrammatic maps, and they fell into various categories, from a kind of a game board where multiple agents were supposed to kind of work out their differences on individual surface, to layered systems, to, again, a kind of analogies to ecology. So let's look at these systems and ecologies a little bit closer, and what hidden potentials of diagrammatic method they imply. Again, a symptomatic project, which I think went furthest at the time, dismissing with much more concrete and spatial ways of representing, is Danzig Prague Toronto by OMA. This idea of a project as purely a diagrammatic framework, some would say a concept and a graphic strategy and nothing more. And some would say, yes, it's an extension of diagrammatic systems way of working, but to a moment where it completely detaches from propositions that have to lay it specifically on the ground. And represented, again, to be characteristic of the projects of the period, there is not a single proposal, but there are a series of scenarios and phasing plans. And yet, of course, in the future, we will make the model. And then if the clients need to make a specific investment in the site, then suddenly buildings and renderings will be proposed. So in some way, the fallback on architectural interpretation does happen, but in much later stage of the project. When the competition gets won, it gets won at the level of the abstraction, not the level of concrete application. I would say OMA should be credited for leaving the longer tradition, and I would say a kind of an accumulated catalog from the history of diagrammatic framework, and that is very much an interesting moment where the program revivers, Bernard Tschumi and Rem Koolhaas, come back to the disciplinary scene with sort of revising how we begin to see a functionalist way of working. and bring back the idea of programmatic systems as a defining basis of the project. But I would say that in moving into a matrix, a kind of ecology of programmatic dots, or maybe even much further than other co-competitors of the same I'm sorry, the left slide is, it's a mistake, it's Bernard Tschumi and his team are proposing for Downsview. With different kind of circuits, or related circuits, or even the repetition of the older Lavillette framework in field operations proposals, where islands, threads, and mats can be even compared directly to points, lines, and surfaces of Tschumi's proposal. So in a way, we haven't left it that far behind. And the other problem we've had with these sort of ecologies, or diagrammatic ecologies, is that the phasing plans proposed to demonstrate complete open-endedness, and yet we did have to prescribe and often even kind of graphically simulate the evolution of the plan in some of the project, which I think is an interesting paradox of what diagrammatic ecology stands for in terms of completely releasing the site from the kind of indexical relationship between diagram and the figure on the ground. But when the diagram doesn't really have to come into contact with problem of architectural form and object, it can get away with a lot more. It's not a coincidence that a lot of these fascinating projects are for urban parks. In some way, you do not have to propose a fixed structure. You can speculate on the recreational cultural programs in the park, and you can anchor it with something as light as a folly. When you actually confront an urban form on an enormous scale in the city, you have to deal with the much longer legacy of how architectural structure enters the city. I think the Learns to Video project for field operations is a very symptomatic one, because the entire rhetoric of the project is based on ecology. But if you look at it for what it is actually, I would argue, another breed of megastructure. But except the megastructure, at this case, can be appropriated guilt-free because it's a found one. It's a reappropriated train track in Manhattan. So you actually don't have to feel guilty or deal with the whole ideological, let's say, politically incorrect position of doing something big and heavy and imposing and dominantly controlling, which I think is also an issue. But nevertheless, something that is supposed to be an ecology, and there are definitely programmatic points or clusters that reminds us of the folies or the cluster of OMA. There are definitely layers of lines of different speeds of lines, and there are programmatic surfaces, those game boards, those scenario playgrounds. This is how the project gets inserted into a larger architectural culture. This is the way it's argued. This is the way it's sort of being valued within the kind of the discourse of the diagrammatic practices of the time. At the same time, if you look at it from the point of view of disciplinary history, I would say the rhetoric of a permanent framework with plug-in elements, that don't have to be spatial ones, they could be programmatic ones, or the idea of multiplying urban ground, or the idea of a system that could propagate and instill itself and sort of self-replicate on an urban scale, are very much part of what even Highline does in the city. And so we have to look at it from the point of view of a history of the discipline and the projects where the system and the form had to collide before. And when they collided before, the same problem. It's not necessarily that it's an insolvable conundrum, but the problem was raised, which is how much you would leave the systems to operate at the level of performance and movement, and how much you have to anchor it in the city. I find the Bernard Tschumi project extremely funny because it's one of those moments where a kind of a extra large gesture in a city becomes to replicate quite literally these diagrammatic systems, points, lines, and surfaces, and overlays them again quite literally. So I think that's an interesting moment. It's not a criticism, it's an attempt to alert us to the fact that these tensions not only plagued those who came before us and those who were very much fascinated with diagrammatic methods in the 90s, they will continue to plague us in the future. And if we don't almost approach it slightly differently, we're likely to fall into the same trap. The third tension is the problem between form and function. If you think of the incredibly amazing description of what an abstract machine is meant to do, it's almost, too good to be true. If you directly imagine in architecture a device that could connect us to social orders, relate them directly to some kind of new spatial configurations that could begin to absorb and distribute preformed matters and functions, and I'm using right now the language of Deleuze, and then somehow never really fully force them into a single stable arrangement, allow for, we spoke about plane of consistency, allow for all of these preformed, pre-formalized diagrammatic elements to coexist in a larger plane consistency and forming a due horizontal regime. It's fascinating. I mean, who wouldn't want to have a project that is born in such a space? But the problem when it comes to diagrammatic method, I think, is also partly rooted in the fact that we forget to distinguish that, diagrams have been a part of architectural thinking for many, many generations, and there are many different kinds of diagrams. So while my personal agenda is not like some thinkers about the diagram, like Mark Garcia, who asks for much careful categorization of the types of diagrams or building of new taxonomies. I don't really claim to propose a better taxonomy, but I do believe in my teaching process that I have to explain that diagrams sometimes have just slightly different genealogies. And if we go very crudely, form and function diagrams definitely have different roots. They might collide during that last phase into a single diagrammatic method, but they come from different places. Again, let's simplify. If we're thinking in terms of 90s, they are basically children of two people, Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas, that are starting to practice and put these things in application. Okay, but Peter Eisenman's diagrams come from a lineage that builds back to Colin Rowe or Witkover. There's a very different way of understanding diagram that is very much about analysis. Indexing invisible, deep formal structure that defines architectural designs. And then an important flip of that occurs with Eisenman is, of course, where he stops seeing diagrammatic, these skeletons, these formal skeletons, as means of analysis and reconstructions of key patterns within architectural history, but sees them as projective, as something that actually generates the project. And I think here, in some way, there are also other threads that we need to account for, which I don't have time for today. But the French method that taught composition based on analysis and combination of various geometric structures is not that dissimilar from what the postmodern project then does, which tries to bring different geometric structures that are derived from architectural history into a new space where they could become animated. And when I say animated, I also mean animated by the further generations such as Draglin, FOA, and then later parametric project. There is a descendance of this formal diagrammatic genealogy that whether the diagram is blobby or boxy doesn't really matter. It's more the principle of taking the basis of the project, the indexical formal diagram that could then be subjected to further manipulation, and whether that's through much more multiplication and let's say division and synthesis in the pre-digital Eisenman or the digital Eisenman and his descendants in the blobby, let's say, geometry. But there are other kinds of diagrams that have nothing to do with the indexical formal ones. There, again, I would not be able to account for a history of program diagrams here, but I think that it's interesting to remind ourselves that there are moments that come from understanding the diagram as a kind of a social geometry, the diagrams of ideal cities, the diagrams of utopia, at the architectural scale, the diagram of the social machine, the abstract machine that is borrowed from Foucault by Deleuze in describing one of the three key types of the diagrams, the Vermivanthus Panopticon, is one of those machines where the social and spatial, where the programmatic and formal principles are coincident, they are one, and they're already been pre-formalized in many ways. They are the strands we need to account for if we question how we design, what is the methodology. I mean, the functionalist design diagrams are actually not architectural in origin at all. They come from scientific management that has to do with management of process. They only become spatialized primarily in post-war functionalism, when architects need to, again, kind of appropriate it. And further, there is a kind of another interesting fascination with making functionalist diagram a means to almost automate, and the cybernetic theory that we now live in a kind of very digital methodology of design are descendants of the attempt to make architecture machines, to make architecture calculate functional requirements, relate them to formal patterns, and then systematically kind of synthesize it. And I'm using Christopher Alexander here. So where would these contemporary practices be left with in terms of the discipline and descendants? Well, hard to say, but I would say that we were, apart from the animated indexical diagram, which you all know what formally produced, with regards to actually fitting formal and functional diagrams, we were kind of stuck in this moment between either going for the so-called diagram architecture, which is a very tight relationship between what a social vision of the architect is for the project and attendant programmatic scheme, and then it almost becoming quite literally translated into a geometric configuration. And the second one is much more reading, creating diagrams of functional moments, zones, intensities, and beginning to relate that to a much more, let's say, part-to-part relationship. Two quick flashbacks, which I think are both anomalies but also promises for the future. One is the revival, what I would argue is a so-called decorated diagram, where there's one example, for example, would be the Seattle Public Library, where we actually begin to articulate the programmatic structure separately and concretize it into a diagram. Some cases might have been totemized to resemble anthropomorphic zoomorphic structure, and in some cases left loose as a kind of a pile. But nevertheless, programmatic body gets constructed through the diagram, and then the formal enclosure gets reapplied. Often the criteria and the reasons for modulating program and form would be different. And in a way, there's these decorated diagrams that would build the diagram and relate it directly into form in a very kind of a tight fit relationship, pull on the disciplinary history from obviously the Russian constructivists that are explicitly referenced by the practitioners such as Ram Koolhaas, and the late functionalist Bauhaus method being converted in a Harvard generation, which are not mentioned explicitly, but nevertheless there are precedents to how the bubble diagram or functionalist flowchart diagram turned into spatial ones become form. And they often viewed in negative terms. I would say, again, it's not a question of assigning a good or bad judgment, but it is more about understanding that there will always be a tension and a need to relate the two. The second anomaly and a paradox is, I think, the architects being much less, I'd say, open and explicit about how the design process, in fact, involves oscillation between multiple diagrams, and diagrams that have remained fully abstract, borrowed from other disciplines, and the ones that have already been formalized or partly formalized, a so-called design model approach by you in studio. I would say this is my kind of crude attempt to reconstruct in a project such as Arnhem Central, where architects, in fact, move between different diagrams, on some cases formalizing the organizations of program, and in the other cases, organizations of form, and then they are attempting to assemble a whole. So two anomalous methodologies that I think promise us something for the future, and that is often seen as a fall of the diagram as a method in the previous generation, is very much a problem of a kind of a loose fit in terms of putting a programmatic diagram and loose fitting it with a formal one, or a loose design methodology, an inconsistency in design methodology that allows for this oscillation. I would say let's embrace both of them as a positive. Now, by no means I mean to say that this somehow exhausts a historical rereading of that work, or I would claim to have placed it in a discipline context successfully. But the reason I'm moving quite rapidly into proposing something is because I believe when you teach and produce architecture in kind of an experimental context of academic studio, it's very important to test these assumptions and practically apply some of these hypotheses so that they can be disproved and a new hypothesis could be formed. I don't believe in a standalone architectural theory without indirect application to the design process. So I would dare to put forward a few extensions. Basing on the three problems and difficulties, I will respond with my own three propositions. The three propositions, I believe that on one hand, we've done the right thing with the diagrammatic terms and the infrastructural term with the contemporary urban theory in the 90s, 2000s, as we actually turned our attention to the project of contingency and moved it away from the project of autonomy, which is thinking of an architectural discipline that concerns with its own sort of timeless questions and evolves within. We looked outside, which is good, but we made our understanding of urban context far too narrow. So I would say we do need to look at context, so we do need diagrams to help us access those contexts and bring contextual information. But what I would argue, now here, please forgive me, I will refer to disciplinary references in an extremely rapid and superficial way, but just to give you a kind of a atmosphere of the references we work with in the studio. I don't believe you can approach the city with raw diagnostics. I don't think you can go out and just find your project out there. Whether you use diagrams or photo documentaries and create a lot of these big urban diary books that were produced in the 2000s, I don't quite believe in that, I'd say, anymore, because I was definitely taught in that tradition. On the other hand, I don't believe that the historical basis would suffice. But I think a combination of the discipline and urban research is a very rich way of building a project. Now, when I say disciplinary diagrams would persist, I don't mean just analysis of precedents or dissection into kind of a formal diagram that I spoke about before, the reductive one. I also mean the contextualizing one, because the precedents would need to be seen as already operating in larger fields of influence and descendants and historical context. When we understand our project with the relationship within multiple contexts, we can begin to think of not only imposition, top-down, which is often criticized as a kind of a legacy of modern way of understanding, but also not just excavation, not just the historical kind of uncovering of the basis of the project. I would use the word variation, because the idea of variation is good. You then begin to vary both on the conditions you've discovered within the context and also on the underlying historical projects that line up with your contemporary problem. So the idea of layering and variation is good. Precedents for this do exist. It's not just the, let's say, systemic and quantitative diagram that handles this sort of synthesis, but there's also other diagrams that one could use, and the precedents in the projects such as postmodern, I would say postmodern multi-authored variation cities, such as Analogous City and Roma in Trota, where a series of rereading and revisions, I think a good revisions is good, because revisionary modernists and the postmodernist thinkers who always revise someone else's project, and they vary on another project that underlies it in an urban diagram. And the problem of synthesis, how do you put multiple divided urban reality into one project? Here, diagrams can definitely be very useful, and perhaps putting those multiple cities together would imply also looking at the history of where the diagram was actually constructing a series of autonomous urban worlds, but they actually part of the same project. So whether it's ideal or anti-ideal city as an imaginary and spatial construct, and ultimately their synthesis in the kind of a polythematic, poly-urban construct. I will, I don't know if it's helpful or confusing, but I decided to use a few references. So when I make a proposition, I will anchor the reference with some of the work that we're doing to give you some visual example of what I mean of the use of the diagram in the future. These constructed contexts, when I said you begin to construct the urban context, but with a visionary and disciplinary outlook, and you also begin to reconstruct the disciplinary context, but with the eye on the contemporary problem. This is what oftentimes the students do. They often begin the project by constructing these terrains, constructing the contexts as worlds that begin to populate with different references. Then these worlds somehow begin to inhabit the project. There's a there's an analysis that comes from the city, and there's also a disciplinary way of rereading the urban space, and often more than one disciplinary way of reading. What to do? The project often becomes the third, the inserted context. In the diagrammatic arrangement of management of multiple contexts, the project often has to be somewhere else. I don't think it can be fully sitting inside the discipline or the city, but it could be allowed to be a platform where both influences could begin to infiltrate. That sort of third layer, and these, you see a couple of these representations are quite literally drawn that way, where the urban reality and the disciplinary autonomous laboratory, they both influence where the project occurs. And yes, sometimes it's read in an applied sense, where it lands on the city, and sometimes it could be read in an autonomous space of the discipline. These interfaces, these spaces of mediations, frontiers form between conceptual drawings of the city and conceptual drawings of the discipline. That's where the project is made. And it's good sometimes that if we're lucky, we can produce our own Campo Marzios, our own Roma Interrota. But it is not always possible to begin to kind of encompass in one project all the multiple diagrams of different levels of abstractions, all the different urban themes. And so I would say the diagram ultimately is a device that allows us to constantly reshuffle, add and subtract, as something that allows us to actually operate in a way of a project never really settling to one single proposition, but actually allows you to shuffle multiple urban reality within the project. Okay, second proposition is, I don't think it's a question of drawing a sharp line between diagrams of systems preclude paying tribute to the form and object. And I think you've seen recently there is definitely an object term, and there's even a lot more conversation on building, right? So we're now coming back from abstract dreams to reality. And again, the pendulum tends to swing always too far in either direction. I think it doesn't have to be either or. But it would snap us a little bit out of a certain avoidance with what to do, because with diagrams, we're often either not wanting to settle on the concrete object, and we sort of diffuse, we continue to make a kind of a programmatic field, or if we're talking about extra problem with the extra large, we would fall back on the very, I would say, settled typologies of the meta element of the city as a kind of a hyper element, hyper building, hyper street, hyper block, hyper park. I don't think we need to do it, and I think the descendants of the today's hyper buildings, I think it's an interesting moment where we're seeing hyper buildings that are still very much similar to the mega gestures of the past, but they tend to hide themselves in the ground, which I think is interesting. But I would rather look at the loops and circuits of these hyper objects and look at them from the diagrammatic operational point of view. Understanding dynamic, of course, has to do with life cycle, and life cycle has always been part of how we think about the city diagrammatically. Life and death of the city, of architecture, of our ideas. But I think live, dynamic system is not necessarily have to be a living ecology or something that has to be programmed through software. It doesn't even have to be an ecology that is difficult to deal with architecturally, so we would then retreat into a fortress, a condensed architectural island. I don't think that is that sharp of a division anymore. We can bring bridges. We can build new bridges between, let's say, disciplinary fascinations that are currently running. For example, interesting, let's call it system city versus typological cities. I think that the new bridges can be found. And when it comes to the elements of these frameworks, I do think we kind of exhausted the points, lines, and surfaces systems. I think we do need to come up with new elements and new ways of weaving them together. I think our generation hasn't really come forward yet with the new kinds of diagrammatic elements that would stand for the core elements of the city that would replace the building, street, block, and park. In the work of the studio, I admit we've definitely swung both ways, and we've definitely went for big objects, super super condensing hyper propositions where multiple typologies are condensed into one configurations. And we've definitely lingered in a kind of antechambers of the project by endlessly diagramming and collapsing systems without really being forced to be explicit as what it generates in form. With regards to condensation and diffusion, again, I've gone through all the tensions with my students where they've this one single condensed architectural object, because it's in a way incompatible with the theoretical aspirations for another project, gets overly diffused. In this case, Olympia is diffusing the new infrastructure of institutions along the entire Ringstrasse in Vienna. It's a project that it becomes very ungainly and very difficult to manage as a single architectural proposition. This is a nice example where I would say the building is both a mat and a network. It is both a series of congested mat-type typologies. It's a project that proposes a transnational kind of domain of cultural management, akin to UNESCO, that relates a lot of art institutions and art museums, and also adds new typologies of storage vaults and transitory customs control, etc. So technically in one map, you see the project that's diffused across entire Europe, so it's very much driven by the system network thinking. And it also presented as a single collapsed architectural object, which matifies the typological discovery. I think if we at least enter both of them on the same drawing board, I think we're already halfway there. With regards to making those machines, I think the interest over time, again, I first started to program new kinds of urban devices. So in some way, I did go and project the systems thinking into an object and try to diagrammatically design the new relationship between different programs, creating kind of a post-condensers, where different programmatic zones were meant to do different things. Then you kind of create a much more dynamic way of understanding trajectory of interaction. Often production takes place. If you think of the machines as both cultural machines and sort of factories of material production, oftentimes these are the projects for both cultural institutions, kind of meta types of cultural institutions, but they're also factories that begin to simulate what happens in an architectural project, how it's reproduced and produced, represented and misrepresented. But what happens over time, I realized that it's not the shell that's important, it's the design of the processor. So in some way, the emphasis on the object shifts from design of an object using diagrammatic systems. We could also use diagrammatic systems as a framework that would produce future objects. So I started to pay much more attention to the architectural products of the diagrammatic framework. If we are talking about a material product moving through a cultural infrastructure of some kind of super expo or super museum is one way. Another way of understanding dismantlement, deconstruction. This is a project that takes a challenge of dismantling the physical presence of institutions and typologies and forms of institutions such as libraries across Europe. The framework, yes, you still see layers, but they're layers that systematically, layer by layer, dismantle the way we think about programmatic and formal types. You still see scores, and you still see trajectories, but again, they're not longer spatializing trajectory on the ground. They're much more temporal, dynamic representations of how you could begin to manipulate. As you can see in here, the building itself, the object that takes on the diagrammatic powers is disappearing. What remains is again the framework, which then produces the new architecture as it passes through it. I think that interests me somehow. I think in there's a new way of understanding the power of diagrammatic thinking in reduction. And final proposition, I don't think the challenge of finding a kind of just the right balance where the project is diagrammatic and when it becomes fully spatial, formal, or even material, I don't think it can be found, but I think a kind of a genuine struggle within the project can be very productive. One thing I would say is that we have to be much more attuned to simply very different kinds of diagrams and a broader gradient of diagrams. There are diagrams that are extremely abstract, non-formal, and there are diagrams that are virtually formal. So this same problem that we've had with the split between the formal and programmatic descendants of two different camps and two protagonists in the 90s and 2000s It's just no longer two poles, but much more varied pieces that populate the process of the project. But I think the challenge today is not necessarily find a way of mediation between extremes, and in a way new positions, let's say the generation that came after Eisenman and Koolhaas, try to find a way to merge formal and programmatic discovery through the diagram occurring kind of at the same time. I think perhaps today a divergence is in order, or hyper-specialization wouldn't be bad, but I mean not this kind. This kind is problematic to me, where we continue to rely on obviously very dissimilar genealogies from the discipline and continue drifting further away in either designing a project through organization of programmatic elements, or we endlessly articulate and over-articulate form using incredible digital tools at our disposal. I think a different kind of divergence would be interesting to consider, where both the social and spatial, programmatic and formal projects could become slow projects, not something that is applicable in immediate kind of problems of practice, but something that could be rediscovered as a project. For example, a project on form sometimes takes a lifetime, takes 3 lifetimes to fully mature. These projects are not popular today, and I think that the problem of using diagrams to engage with social, the social agency of architecture and understanding how people live and what kind of neighborhoods, and could a project become fully contextual and projective in that way, is very extremely valid. And so what is also valid is finding different typological, morphological way of integrating the project, multiple diagrams. It's not a question of marrying a formal diagram and a project immediately, but staying with the problem of form and using diagrams to multiply. And again, I don't mean this. I don't mean that we somehow, when we hear form, we think of a kind of over purifying the formal models we have at our disposal and returning to the history of ideal form. And on the other hand, I don't mean dissolution of architecture just by simply engaging with the utopian or socially projective aspect. I think there's another layer of depth that could come in, and it has to do with meaning. The project of meaning has been brought back through the diagrams that were used by postmodernists. And I think we find ourselves in a moment where another bifurcation could be used very productively. We've become very proficient with digital tools of generating form, but perhaps we haven't layered with another set of diagrams that would talk about the issues of deeper spiritual evolution of who we are, how we live, the cities that we make, and societies that we structure. I think, again, in a kind of perhaps naive nostalgia for that project would be good if we marry it to today's problem of form that has an elaborate complexity, morphological problem of morphological integration, and doesn't just make it at the level of form, but also deepen the discourse. What I mean through the experiments in the studio, we've definitely done many years of trying to deal with a practical problem. As I said, the gradient of diagrams is useful, and we've got done with a full range from building a project very systematically from programmatic platforms and wiring different programmatic units, and then much later or never turning them into form. And then we also have gone through the project of endless variations of formal prototypes that are based on contextual or much more autonomous disciplinary forces, which then can be turned into potentially parameters. We don't really use Rhinoceros or other software as a way to automatically generate the project, but we do often in the project understand that there must be a way to accelerate the production of variation. But I think in some way that is too easy. It's too easy to deploy one type of another diagram and then confront, well, then what do I do with the other half, with the other domain? I think if we're going to talk about diagrammatic theories and methods coming back, we can't rely on a magical abstract machine to do the work for us. We have to build the machine. And often it becomes extremely painful and difficult way of doing it. There are projects I've done where students would begin to engineer the equivalent of diagrammatic translation machines, so that the prototypes, I know it's very difficult to see in a line work, so let me show you here. This is a much more spatial version of this project, which moves us from, let's say, taking samples from the city and moving it to different platforms. In case samples from Piazza Navona in Rome, there's a formal machine that indexes, rereads, archaeologically excavates, laminates, understands analogies to urban text and writing and rewriting. There's another machine that is a much more late modern functionalist machine that sees the potentials in lines as trajectories, that sees the potentials in surfaces as condensers, that sees kind of a much more, let's say, programmatic future for an excavated trace. There is an important urban condensing machine. All of these machines somehow needs to be built into the project, and if we have to genuinely be aware and become accountable our methodological leaps, they have to become the substance of the project. I don't necessarily mean that solves all the problems. In a way, it multiplies the problems. But I think that one of the problems with the past generation is that we've believed in the magic, but we haven't taken the dirty work of making the processes of translation and combination visible and engaging with that. But the second branch of what I mean by moving forward with the diagrams and form is through the idea of so-called multiplier, formal multiplier. What emerged often when the students try to convert the diagram, but not, I mean, like oversimplified functionalist diagrams of here the programs go here and here's your brief translated into form. Much deeper than that. If we talk about translations of diagrams of utopia, and if theorists like Anthony Vidler already argued that we can't really translate utopia into space or form, as on contact with reality, utopia loses its power. Yes, but in an attempting to translate utopia into at least a version of itself as spatial or formal, we also get something very important. We get multiple versions of the same utopian thought. We have multiple versions of the same social diagram. And this is what the students would encounter. They would take a brief, for example, to, understanding as an exercise, Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun, and try to give it a spatial configuration in the beginning of the project. Well, that is impossible. Each element gets reinterpreted by different artists. Each different plane of reference distorts how you're going to read. So more and more references, much more rich, much more, in a way, messy context for reconstructing or reimagining urban archetypes, towers, theaters, palaces. How would they be reconstructed into more city? Which references would be used? Which traits would be comprised? Virtually impossible. Diagrams often help to deal with the sort of mess that ensues. And if we think of ultimately the project having a coherence as a kind of an urban space, and I don't mean a city as a kind of a city plan, but conceptually it's always a city, then diagrams become platforms upon which these multiple elements can land and begin to synthesize in a much more rigorous way. And a similar idea of a multiplier pushing the project of form further. Here, the diagram becomes a means to transcribe, but not just like a transcripts and Manhattan transcripts of the journey, but much more deeper idea of a journey. Here, a student constructs a series of contemporary mythologies to obviously refer to the Greek and Roman mythology and such models as eternal return or hero's journey, and finding contemporary protagonists, transcribing their life cycles, seeing their encounters with the archetypes of the city. Those transcripts then become related to the diagrams of the fluid typologies that destabilize the archetypes. I mean, I'm calling it typology for the moment because in a way it starts with a kind of a typology, but what it ends up being is a something very difficult to deal with, is a sort of a diagrammatic skeleton of some sort. It's a series of urban rhythms, subdivisions, column grids that are directly a product of the multiple diagrammatic representations coming together. But they're not yet proposals, they're not yet new, fully formed houses, theaters, palaces, etc. They are in that flux. They are pre-formalized traits, and in a way they could be seen as pre-functional traits. So somehow going a little bit deeper with what programming or what is the social programmatic trigger for architecture, I think we get into an interesting messy level, and also delaying a little bit the practical translation of diagram into buildable form, or using a so-called materializer machine into fully materially structurally defined form, I think is an interesting set of suspensions that could propose a new way of working. So conclude, I think that for me, the future lies into animating a disciplinary project, understanding that there's a blip on a radar at the late last century, but it's still part of a much longer disciplinary project. We deal with the space of inclusion, mediation. We work between domains. And ultimately, I do think that diagrams will always be part of a much richer arsenal of an architect who is first and foremost interested in a conceptual project, and only then in sort of a kind of much more pragmatic deliverable. So yes, and it's part of a broader, let's say, apparatus of the work. But diagrams are definitely much less visible, explicit. We don't celebrate them as the subject of our work. They're definitely the means to get to certain points. And I think there is definitely a future project of the diagram, but it is still under construction.
Improvise myself as a respondent.
If there are any questions,
First of all, yes.
So, apologies for overwhelming you with the visual material. The audience is really.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. It's like impressive images, impressive diagrams, but I mean, it's not. Well, yes, I have a kind of a question or more a suggestion. I don't know. I mean, I would like to propose a kind of two keywords, let's say, in order to even establish a possible potential discuss you propose today. Well, the first really potential of the diagrams is, stands within the concept of ambiguity, as I told that in the presentation. Why? Because if we look, for instance, because it allows this sort of transitions, continuous transitions. As you presented this somehow dichotomy, between form and functional diagrams. But I would say there is embedded within the diagram, there is a very strong somehow dichotomy that somehow diagrams allows you to deal with. It is the dichotomy between what is the space of the symbolic and the space of the necessities. Because, for instance, if we take a look at the history of architecture, we see that during the period of the Renaissance, for instance, for Alberti, the central, let's say, the plan of let's say the San Pietro in Montorio, the Temple of San Pietro in Montorio, and the central plan diagram like was somehow established in order to was somehow drawn, was used in order to establish the space of the symbolic. What was at the center was the most representative things. While 100 years later, we see the architects use the same form in order to claim that what is at the center is the space of necessities. For instance, if we see the same plan of the San Pietro in Montorio that is used in order to manage animal architecture, as I already told in my article, in my thesis about the decorated diagram. So what means this? It means that the diagrams allows somehow continuous transition between the space of the symbolic and the space of the necessities, and it allows you to be really ambiguous in your own position. When you make a form, when you make a discourse, you do not have to declare what values you belong to in order to make that form, because somehow you're talking about a very, I'm going to say, you can be ambiguous. I mean, you can somehow embed values within necessities, or at the same time you can embed necessities within values. So I see this sort of very hybrid and ambiguous nature of the diagram as this real potentiality. Well, the second keyword I would like to express is predictability. Somehow you presented these two very huge categories of form diagrams and functional diagrams, but I would add a third kind of categories, which is the one of time diagram that deal with time. and try to understand how your design will, how your design choices somehow predicts what will happen in the future. What will happen, the becoming of your, what will be, predicts the becoming of your design, of your initial design. And at the same time, the diagram really allows you to evaluate how buildings design somehow was able, that were done, that were somehow, that already exist, somehow were able to predict what happened afterwards, their becoming, basically. Mm-hmm. So, I try to, this is not a question, this is a kind of a, let's say a synthetic, let's say, attempt to find several keywords that could allow our discussion.
It's interesting to raise these issues, because I think, if I understand you correctly, I think the idea of ambiguity and the relationship between symbolic and, let's say, spatial or necessity, as you're saying, I do find that one of the reasons diagrams, let's call it there are two practices of diagrams, high and low. And I would say one is a slow project of form and there's a fast project of form, right? So the conceptually high is the one that deals with architecture as a means of society to project values, social orders, and this is where I think the mythological project is very much relevant today, even though it's extremely unpopular view, I understand, is because diagrams at a high level of understanding have always functioned that way. They've always put our place in the world and our consciousness relationship to the infinite into some kind of legible finite structure that could then be even monumentalized somehow in space. And I think that is partly the problem of the latest adrift generation who that try to make the diagrams that are equally adrift or feel like. I think if I wrote a piece a while ago which is about the soups. The soups are basically diagrams where we were so threatened by the new theory where Alberti's project, or in general the problem of stable figure that has a clear hierarchical relationship, is not possible because of all the theories we're being inundated. So we, just in case, we made the project soupy. It's either bits and pieces floating in the green sea or at best in a provisional container, because anything hierarchical would be deemed not fitting with our society at the time. But I think that's the struggle. If you move away from a cross to a soup with carrots, right? How do you deal with the sort of, this diagram somehow stands for our society? And this is also, I think, an unfinished project, because I don't think a soup is somehow an exhaustive representation of flow, field, right? And a kind of a dynamic understanding of evolution of space. But nevertheless, the axis, and the composition, the figure, and the volume of the building were not available to us to use within our diagrams. So in a way, what you're saying, this symbolic diagram is definitely to be determined of our buildings. And if you look at, again, I'm not a good historian of the entire, let's say, project of the late 20th century, but I'm sure a historian would say, well, there is a symptomatic repetition of these diagrams. It's either a dancing surface, a soupy thing, and then maybe implicit line, something like that, right? There are a series of diagrams that we try to create as symbolic representations of how we see us functioning in space. They're provisional, they're often implicit, but they do begin to emerge. If you look at the contemporary art districts, right, and diffuse master plans, if you looked at the project, for example, such as Sanaa's 21st Century Museums and other SUPI projects that always diffuse potentially replaceable object conceptually in some kind of field or medium without a center, without orientability of left, right, north, south, right? So that's all symptomatic of the symbolic orientation. But with regards to necessity, that's a low project. That's where I say, absolutely, a designer trying to make a project needs to analyze the site, the access, the notion of functional distribution. There's no harm, or somehow we shouldn't deride the low project of the diagram, which is a just much more straightforward tool. But those are very different kinds of diagrams. And I think you're asking an interesting question, because ambiguity between how large is symbolic diagramming of space then results in the built form I think to me it's again a much more protracted process of relating the two. But the idea of the time and inevitability, see, I personally find it attractive intellectually, but very difficult to deal with when I have to manage a project. One of the promises of diagrammatic framework is that it will unfurl. The semiotic project of becoming and the diagrammatic project of becoming are both extremely becoming of the sign, becoming of the sign, Eisenman's and always becoming, right? And so is the Deleuzian for kind of Foucauldian diagram. It's you set up a diagrammatic framework, you kind of put it in performance, and it becomes. How? Who makes it become something? It sounds amazing if you write a paper, but when you're staring at a project and the student asks you, so do I do a scenario? How do I finish a scenario? If I finish a scenario, does it mean I design it? Does it mean I design the master plan at the end of the scenario? Those are much more painful questions. So yes, it opens the trajectory of the endless temporal sort of evolution of the project. And yet we also have to give something legible, something specific, something not predictable or inevitable, but we need architecture. Architecture is the only way to make our ideas legible and consumable even beyond this room by people who inhabit the world of reality outside of our intellectual ivory towers, right? So I believe in the question of legibility and finitude. You do need to put an architectural form to the idea in a way to make it legible. So in that sense, you can't make it. For me, then maybe your question would be interesting to correlate with a fascination with the idea of scenario planning that was borrowed from economics into architecture. Planning for different scenarios. You can plan for scenarios, but it doesn't mean you determine and totalitarian control the scenario. So you can understand that you can definitely design within unpredictable and open-ended, but you still have to design. My problem is not with the temporal, the diagram as a kind of a timeline of architectural work. I have no problem with. I have a problem where it doesn't become clearly related to something that architecture can communicate on its path of becoming. So I hope it answers something.
Yeah. So I invite the audience.
Again, just following on this line of discussion, because I think it's very important to me. And starting from your proposal for this kind of categorization of diagrams, I would like to focus on an aspect that for me is very important, and it is about also the becoming of the action, actually. Because you were, Andy, also talking about the design of the process. So, which kind of process are we mentioning, are we implying? Because if I think about the process of the city, the future process of what will become, what will happen in the outer space, in the world I'm planning, I'm drawing, I'm projecting, it's a case different from another in which I'm thinking about the process of what I am doing as a producer of something. So if my product as an architect is not the building, is not the outer space, but it's what I draw, is the trace of what, and the accumulation of this kind of things which combines within the system, the outer system. So maybe I can draw, I can use the diagrammatic approach to draw my action, to draw what I will do strategically in the future, in my perspective, and in that perspective which will embrace maybe some other actors and automata, even. Not only actors, not only intentional actors. So in this case, maybe I can think about some maps, some diagrams, let's say, which are not about the shaping of the buildings, but the shaping, as in your last example about shaking, trailing the mythoscape. It's not the transcripts of a journey, of a mythical journey, but it is the transcript of my supposed journey as a fighting actor. So it's really a strategical diagram which I can combine with other kinds of drawing which I will produce.
Of course.
So I have some synchronic things, which are my plans, and some diachronic attempts to draw. So what is the syntax of this kind of trajectories? How can I socialize them? And do you think in these kind of examples any kind of association with this? Because for instance, just to say, the systems condensing objects you mentioned when you talked about systems and objects was something which sounds to me very similar to this, even if that system was the urban system, if I understood it correctly.
Yes. You're right to raise these questions, and I mean, let's just be completely honest here. I don't have the answers that are black and white, and I don't think we should seek black and white answers. I'm partly sharing with you a similar search and similar set of struggles that we encounter kind of day to day. But I agree. I can tell you just the evolution of my thinking over the years, that these two kinds of processes, at the very least, we need to be careful to distinguish. The process of designing the process as kind of a methodological process of designing, is very different from accounting for longer, broader processes that architecture triggers in the city and in the world, right? To me, I became overwhelmed when I was a student because they somehow asked me to immediately magically conflate the two. I couldn't. So when I teach, I separate the two. If the student wants to have much more clarity and accountability over designing, putting their conjectures into new ways of design, yes, you do need to do the work to do a couple of trial runs, to construct the machinery, to test the process, self-critique the process, and then judge from the products, are you getting anything interesting? Should your diagrammatic reasoning evolve because you're getting a predictable product? That's one automata versus imagination of an architect conflation, because again, I never believe in one or the other. I think they both coexist. But it's a very different ways of thinking about the process. And maybe here, if you have systems that enter the project and they have to find their way to the final outcome, I don't believe in going home and with the Alvar Aalto magic of 3 a.m. sort of like, you guys sort of wake up with a synthetic one. And often it is a closet matter in architecture. How do you synthesize enormous amount of information? My students at least know not to be afraid to come and show me the 3 a.m. disasters so we can look at how we fail to synthesize and synthesize again. The second process you're talking about is interesting to me, and it's a very recent moment where I begin to again embrace a little bit more of that. I became burned, let's call it that way, with this open-ended emergence programmatic network. I did not claim to politically engage the city in my work. I never claimed to kind of broad social agency for my new types. I did not try to change the world, but in a way, I think it's very important to embrace the long term and something we can't control and can't even fully participate if we're going to talk about the city. So you're absolutely right. But that process, to me, I think we can't put certain simulations of how architecture may perform in that new reality, and in some way we release that process, right, to happen. Again, coming from Soviet Union, I have a sort of a very deep-seated allergy in managing things, right? So I tend to let go. And yes, the future journeys, the future lives that are unfolding, a rich combination of the maps, diagrams, and drawings. Do I imply that somehow should, like any other visionary futuristic project, I have a relationship, a critical relationship to the present, and I have a kind of a drive towards the future, but I don't mean it as a this is how we're going to do this, and this is how the strategy and the tactic for implementing that now. So I think it's important to keep a degree of awareness of where the visionary speculative project stands and the processes it triggers versus the real. Again, I think it's very difficult. And again, it may not just be my area of expertise. Much more elaborate digital databases are necessary, and we've seen it with the if I understood from Italian presentation before me, did speak about GIS and the revolution of cartography. I think we have tried to entrust with the digital diagrammatic interfaces our knowledge of the city, the kind of a meta-knowledge, and then wanting to understand how the city would evolve. Again, if you think of a German and Russian master planning institutions versus now we're all into simulation and prediction, I find, again, it's difficult for me to sort of see that somehow by using the diagram we could have a much better model than a top-down master planning, or release it all to sort of a swarm of data. So I find it difficult, and my projects are very explicitly, they're academic projects that are visionary projects. They're not implied as a practical applications. The mythoscape of a different kind of Rome that this student had attempted to create, it's an imaginary disciplinary city that uses our archetypes borrowed from Rome and tracks their historical evolution through the Western city, and then subjects them to a much more contemporary conditions of drift, global moves, and splitting of contemporary nuclear family, blah, blah, blah. And it tries to just shake things up, destabilize. In order to make the project legible, I have to speculate a few phases further down the road. Do I imply this as a way of changing Rome or making Rome better? No. I think, whereas the Berlin project, for example, the morphological project, the same thing. Where was I? Here. This is a project on using morphological study of Berlin, understanding, updating disciplinary themes to post-dialectic themes, building on Gur's work on morphology, and then obviously using further references such as Aldo Rossi. And reimagining a city that resembles Berlin as much as Moscow, as much as Rome, and it's a future disciplinary city within where new morphologies could continue. So it's a much more laboratory setting. And I'm being quite honest about it. These babies haven't really been released in the wild yet. There is another project, perhaps done by someone else, who would be much more invested in seeing, okay, you have a new type. Let's understand, could we trigger a process of the new type emerging in the city? And 20, 50 years later, could we dispense entirely with the idea of museum, theater, city hall entirely? And how could that project be? I think that there's a much more project on the ground that someone should tackle, and diagrams could, you see what I mean? It's also a question of disciplinary boundary, I think. I'm much more aware of what I cannot do than what I can do, and at least I can be explicit of that. And then somebody else could take that disciplinary slice and work on it. I think the danger of what happened before with diagrams, they were promised to do everything all at once magically. And I think that's a really problematic thing. And then we threw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, you can't do it all magically? Out you go. So it's all these extremes. I think if one can claim a slice of the project on the city and do a particular kind of diagrammatic evolution within that slice, and be much more specific what sort of diagrams you're using and why, and leave the rest to someone else, I think we'll get further. If we share, divide and conquer rather than, yeah. But your question is extremely valid. I wish I had a better answer as to how the process would be supported in the long-term kind of strategic thinking about the city. I think it's an extremely valid and urgent question.
I was just a short reply. I was implying a sort of management which is a divergent management, which is not a systematic one. So, of course, if we imply that our project is something which cannot predict, but just assume the possibility of having something deviating what you're doing in another direction. So you are accepting something from the outside. So in that sense, you can just have some features of divergence.
But it allows us to feel secure as architects. It gives us thinking validity without holding on to the box. And I think that's where the problem with architecture as design versus architecture as a way of thinking comes into mind, right? I think we also develop ourselves as thinkers first, and then makers of let's say, service providers, let's put it this way. So I think if you think of the first as a way of thinking, and an architecture can feel extremely valid and secure because it just evolves as a way of thinking about reality, about cities. We are some of the most versatile, plastic thinkers, and we don't give ourselves enough credit. We definitely don't make enough money, considering how good we are at thinking. But the other half is, it doesn't mean that somehow our ability to put ideas into buildings or churches is to be devalued. I think it's also an incredible ability of the Renaissance architect coming in. I said, I have this vision, and here's a city to go with it. I have this vision, but here's an amazing new symbolic structure and a new typology of religious space. I think that is also a kind of a leap very few people can do. So for me, that also is interesting as we move forward. How, because that was partly the problem, this information manager rhetoric of the 90s and 2000s. I find it fascinating, but also dangerous. If I'm going to compete with a professor in statistics, in how I can manage information, I'm going to lose. And that's going to make me feel very bad about myself. And then I'll spend another 20 years learning to use computer software so I can become better at management of statistics, just to realize when I hit 40, 50, that actually I knew much more than the professor of statistics, and I should have utilized my ability to think about it. So I think it's also a question of reclaiming what is our authority and what's our specificity as architects, and feeling a sense of added security about that. And that, again, I'm digress, since we have to finish and get out of the room.
Sorry for my English. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I tried to welcome this discussion because I think maybe exists a plan of consistency when the two processes can meet, perhaps, because in the architects deal with diagram made by someone else in our activity. These diagrams are translations of programs and other issues. So I think it's very important to study how to use these diagrams. Not only the diagrams that we can do by ourselves. Okay. Because I think also I miss your words. Diagrams are device of translation. Translation of what is invisible. So I think if you think about the process of architectural design, maybe it's better to think to study how to translate text, figures, and maps, and diagrams, speech in architectural diagrams, then to produce before the process diagrams.
Yes.
It's very important to produce, to be able to produce.
Yes.
I like very much your expression engineering of the diagrams. We have to become engineering diagrams, but now maybe the challenge is how to extract architectural figures within the process.
Yes.
Not before.
Yes.
I think about, for instance, example you show us before is Parc de la Villette of Grand College. That is a modelization of a process. Because the diagram, the architect plays a double game. Because one game is to take the program, the function program that is without architecture, only functions, only okay. But the diagram is find out architectural figures, and the typicity of architectural figures. Almost to the polder landscape of Dutch landscape and the vertical structure of the skyscrapers. So the architect plays a double game because he employs diagram, functional diagram, and macros, but he sees figures, architectures within the diagram, because the diagram represents visibility, but also it is itself.
Exactly.
So,
No, it's very important. Very important. I think it's very important, and I think it's partly, again, we're going back to when we teach or when we are part of it, where we have a privilege to be part of a process of architecture being born. I think that's when we have to intervene and encourage the production of the diagram, not just like you said, bring it in from outside or from other disciplines. The making of the diagram, and it relates to the idea of, let's say, if you use Arnheim's idea of visual thinking, yes, there's an idea of kind of ideogrammatic thinking through the image or through association. I think to teach diagrammatic thinking that allows you to put intermediary concepts or traits of the project in the shape of the diagram, it allows me often, what it allows the student to do is to reach a project of much higher complexity without losing a sense of, not control, but conscious incorporation of the multiple traits. And oftentimes, you're right, for the project to be original, the diagrams have to be made from analysis of text, analysis of real urban condition, analysis of other projects. But they have to be made by the author if they're utilized or recycled in some way. It would take away from originality of the work. So yes, it's a tool, but in a way it doesn't allow for as many shortcuts as they've claimed. It actually makes the work harder, but the payoff is there. So I agree. I agree the idea of generative, and I mean, for Koolhaas, for example, it's good you're bringing him in because he does both. He does both extreme reduction. This is what is New York, and I'm going to give you much simpler and much more retroactively clear vision of New York, and then I'm going to cycle into my version of modernity and use it. So there's a kind of you can't even skip that step. You can't even have a relationship to the city without doing your own project on the city, making your own ways of extracting urban ideas, then utilizing, and then in your practice constantly reinvent and re-describe the diagram from abstractly. So it's, again, no shortcuts. But that's where, I think that's the idea of slow project or degree of patience is needed, because if you don't take the time to generate your own diagram, you wouldn't have your own basis to build a new project on. So it is difficult, but I think ultimately a very rewarding process. If we learn to generate our own diagram and then utilize these proto projects towards a larger whole, then yeah, we have potential to actually uncover something and describe new conditions. Everybody's hot. No.
Okay.
So we
Thank you for your patience.